Here in section 4.3, we start to discuss the graphs of tangent and cotangent. Tangent and cotangent are both periodic functions, just like sine and cosine, except tangent and cotangent repeat themselves every pi units. Here I have a table, and just like sine and cosine, into our tangent function we have x values in radians that we will be plugging into our tangent function. Now keep in mind that as we put these angles into our function, that tangent is the sine value divided by the cosine value. So we can take our sine value of that angle and the cosine value of the angle and divide them to get tangent. So at negative pi, sine is 0, cosine is negative 1, sine divided by cosine, we get 0. We're going to do this for all of these angles. Negative square root of 2 divided by 2, and then we're going to divide that by the cosine. Well, these are exactly the same values. They're both negative, so we get a positive 1. Negative 1 divided by 0, we get undefined. So notice that everywhere that cosine is 0, so if cosine of the value of the angle is 0, then tangent of that angle will be undefined, because we're dividing by cosine. And anytime I divide by 0, we get undefined. Here we're going to get negative 1, 0, 1. Cosine is 0, so we get undefined. Negative 1, 0, positive 1, undefined, negative 1, and 0. So you start to see a pattern.
And the pattern that we see is that tangent repeats itself every pi units. So from 0 to pi, we see the same pattern over and over and over again. For tangent, we keep track of the values, the x values, from minus pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. So from asymptote to asymptote. So when we graph tangent, we'll put asymptotes at minus pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. It would also have an asymptote at 3 pi over 2. And focusing on what happens between asymptotes, from minus pi over 2 to pi over 2, we have negative pi over 4, that's one of the midpoints. Positive pi over 4 is also one of the midpoints, and also 0. So from undefined to undefined, we have 3 values, 3 points that we want to keep track of. And at minus pi over 4, tangent is negative 1. At positive pi over 4, tangent is positive 1. And so our graph also has a point at 0. So at 0 we have 0, at minus pi over 4 we have minus 1, and at x value pi over 4 we get a y value of 1. So our tangent graph will get close to the asymptotes and go through those points. So the points that we keep track of, and what I usually do is I start at the very center, both vertically and horizontally, put my point there at the very center, and then you go to the right, to the midpoint on the right, you go up 1, to the midpoint on the left, you go down 1. So if I was going to graph the another period between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, then I would start at the midpoint at pi and plot my point at the very center, and then I would find the midpoint on the left, which would be 3 pi over 4, and I would find a midpoint on the right, which would be 5 pi over 4, and from the middle I would go to the right and up 1 unit. I would go to the left midpoint and go down 1 unit. And this would be another period of tangent. So when we think about the basic shape of tangent, we think about the shape from minus pi over 2 to positive pi over 2, from asymptote to asymptote, and that is a horizontal distance of pi units, so the period for tangent is pi.
So to summarize tangent, the domain, or the x values that actually go into the function and yield a value that is not an asymptote, will be all the x values except for odd multiples of pi over 2. So we start to have issues with pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2. These are all the places where cosine of those angles is 0. And we know that if cosine of an angle is 0, and we divide by cosine, then we get an undefined value that we cannot plot on the graph for tangent. The range of tangent is all real numbers, so we go all the way up and all the way down for the y values. So there's all y values being used for tangent. That's just what it was for test 1. The period of our function is pi, so every pi units it gets repeated. The vertical asymptotes, all of the x values that go into the function that yield undefined values, we have asymptotes at those odd multiples of pi over 2. So the x values that go in and give us an asymptote occur where cosine is 0. So the domain, the values that we're not allowed to use into the function, and the asymptotes are exactly the same x values, where cosine is 0. Tangent is an odd function just like sine, and if I put a negative input into tangent, it's just the same as if I did a tangent value of the positive input and the negative comes on the outside.